Hi everyone, welcome to the 25th episode of the Civics Project. Today's session focuses on public schools. Thank you for joining us. Hi, I'm Debbie. I'm 19 and a junior at UCLA majoring in chemistry. I'm from Los Angeles, California. Today, I and my fellow interns, Siri and Jenna, will be sharing what we've learned about the government's involvement in the public education system. Before we begin, I want to offer a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the original land caretakers of the Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. We are grateful to work for the Tarawatim, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Nukbatam, the ancestors, Mahihuram, the elders, and Iyuhinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. I'd first like to talk about the development of public schools in the United States. Prior to the creation of public schools, children were educated through a variety of arrangements that depended on funds like tuition, charitable contributions, and property taxes. This meant that children were not provided with a similar level or quality of education, nor was everyone lucky enough to go to school. Public schools started forming in a few affluent communities by the 1840s. This created a call for compulsory education for all children. Massachusetts was the first state to establish compulsory school laws, which encouraged other states to follow suit. This provided all children with free and accessible education that was funded by the state and was created in the hopes of providing them with the necessary tools to become successful and informed citizens. Overall, this was a gradual development, but by 1870, 78% of children between the ages of 5 and 14 were enrolled in school. Public schools today are managed at the state and district level. The federal government does not have direct control over the education system, but they can provide any necessary support or resources. State governments oversee the general education system and are responsible for things like funding and general education standard policies. At the local level, school boards and school districts manage the actual operations of schools. While they must work to implement state policies, they also have the power to create their own educational policies. This gives schools some freedom to do and operate how they would like. Everyone is guaranteed a free, appropriate public education, otherwise known as FAPE or FAPE in the United States. It is required under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Public schools are supposed to accept everyone, regardless of factors like income, religion, and education proficiency. Starting in the late 20th century, schools began to provide programs and services to address different social needs to accommodate students of different backgrounds, particularly those from low-income families. These services included school meals, after-school care, and counseling. There have also been many efforts to provide free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities. It is up to public schools to evaluate students who may need special education or related services. They must then provide all necessary and appropriate resources and support at public expense. Schools have a responsibility to meet the educational needs of all students to the same extent. Immense progress has been made since the establishment of compulsory education, but we should still constantly evaluate whether schools are setting students up for success.
Thank you, Debbie. Hello, everyone. I'm Jenna. I'm 19 and a sophomore at UCLA majoring in business economics. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. However, I'm joining this call from Westwood, California. Today, I will be diving into the history of civil rights in education, as well as policy issues associated with disability education. As Debbie shared, schools have a responsibility to provide free and accessible education to all students, but often in practice, that doesn't happen. One Supreme Court ruling that began to give way to a wave of positive change occurred in 1854 in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. In this case, it was ruled that segregation in education violated the concept of equal educational opportunity. This case concerned the issue of racial segregation, and it set a precedent conveying that all people deserve access to a quality public education. People sometimes assume that once schools were desegregated, educational opportunities became more certain and reliable in the US. Access to education helps determine many things about the future opportunities and choices that young people will have later in their life. So discrimination in education can have long-term damaging effects. In 2001, under the George W. Bush administration, the federal government passed the No Child Left Behind Act, which created more standardized testing requirements in which any schools receiving federal money needed to prove that students were learning at established rates. If the schools failed to prove that their students were achieving, rather than creating more resources for those schools, the law reduced the federal funding that those schools could use. The consequence was that for underfunded schools that were already struggling to provide enough for teachers, materials, and equipment, they had to struggle even harder, and students suffered. Some schools, in order to try and improve test scores, started expelling students with disabilities who couldn't perform well on standardized tests, particularly when schools weren't providing enough disability accommodation. Therefore, although the No Child Left Behind Act was supposed to provide better education standards, it actually created more discrimination, with the worst effects being experienced by low-income students of color with disabilities, many of whom would wound up getting arrested for truancy or other minor offenses, resulting in youth incarceration. In theory, students with disabilities are supposed to be protected from discrimination by specific laws that address the right to an accessible and appropriate educational environment. Disability education or special education can be defined as the particular curricula, instructions, and programs created to meet the needs of students with disabilities. Most advancement in disability education in the United States has been quite recent. While considering how many resources and programs are available today, this may come as a surprise. From the time that the country was established until the 1970s, little to no advancement was made in regards to disability education. It was not until the late 1960s and early 1970s when opportunities first began to steadily emerge. Once positive change began to be made, however, they gave way to a continuous string of progressive policies, decisions, and laws. Every student has the right to comprehensive and individualized education, and during this time period, serious steps toward that concept have been made. However, these changes did not come easily by any means. They were the outcome of decades of efforts and battles that have ultimately contributed heavily to constructing much more accepting and encouraging educational environments within the United States. The concept of excluding children with disabilities from education legally can be traced back to 1893. This was the year that the Massachusetts Supreme Court upheld the expulsion of a student due only to struggles with academics. Relatively shortly afterward, the Wisconsin Supreme Court voted to deny education to a student with cerebral palsy. In the time period following this decision, large improvements in disability education were made. For instance, in 1966, an amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was made. The action provided federal funding to public schools for students with disabilities and represented a large leap forward. In 1973, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act declared that a person with a disability cannot be excluded or denied benefit from any program or opportunity receiving federal financial aid, regardless of whether it is public or private. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children was signed into law. This act is also known as the IDEA, and I will delve into its significance. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, can be defined as a mandate that declares that students with disabilities have access to free, adequate, and individualized education. The actual text of the act states as follows, quote, "Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities," end quote. In order to preserve consistency with these concepts, the IDEA rests upon 6 pillars. The first of which is the development of individualized education programs. Along with parents, educational professionals must develop IEPs, or individualized education programs. This is done in order to determine an individualized approach to a student's educational needs. Ultimately, IEPs help students to reach their full potential. This process is one that does involve much time and effort. However, the benefits reached by its completion are essential. The next pillar is free and appropriate public education. Simply, schools must use their federal and state funds to provide students with education tailored to their IEP, as well as their grade level standards. The third pillar is to provide the least restrictive environment possible. This pillar explains how students must be integrated into the classroom experience as much as possible, and that they also must be provided with necessary assistive technology and service personnel. Appropriate evaluation represents the fourth pillar. This pillar simply states that students should only be given special services once a thorough evaluation has taken place. This is done in order to decrease the number of misidentifications. The fifth pillar involves parent-teacher participation. It defines how parents and teachers must be actively involved in a student's education. They should support and, when necessary, combat ideas and changes related to the child's education. An essential component of this pillar is the minimization of conflict between parents and teachers. Finally, the sixth pillar involves the protection of students with disabilities and their rights. The protection of the families of students is also incorporated into this pillar. In the present day, technology plays an important role in providing adaptable and individualized education to students with disabilities. In order to assist with listening abilities, students have access to FM and sound field systems, which can broadcast and raise the volume of the instructor's voice. Text-to-speech tools allow students with visual impairments as well as reading impairments to receive the lesson in an auditory manner. This can look like things as simple as free apps or browser plugins. Finally, sip and puff systems, also known as SNP systems, involve sipping or puffing on a controller in order to indicate a response, communicate, or interact with a computer program. Although many important strides regarding disability education have been made, the fact that only 65% of students with disabilities graduate high school nationally, compared to 86% of students without disabilities, demonstrates that there is still a ways to go in order to ensure that every student has access to equal opportunities and educational services. As shared earlier, disability education can be severely undermined if public schools, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, don't have access to funding.
Thank you, Jenna. Hi all, I'm Siri, and I'm a rising fourth year undergrad at UCLA. I am majoring in human biology and society and minoring in disability studies. And I'll be talking about the policies and its influences on public school funding. So the majority of public school funds comes from the state and local and private sources, ranging at about $1.5 trillion for education at all levels, of which 45.6% comes from the state and 37.1% comes from local governments. To put this in perspective, 83 cents of every dollar spent on education was estimated to come from the state and local levels in the years 2004 to 2005. The federal government contributes only 8% to elementary and secondary education, which is utilized as an emergency response system, which is a means of filling gaps in state and local support for education when critical national needs arise. Federal funding for education programs is estimated to increase by $9.3 billion from 2001 to support economically disadvantaged students and students with disabilities. These federal funds are distributed to the state and local districts to be used for the purposes of the program. ESEA, or otherwise known as Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is also known as Title I, receives $13.3 billion. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which Jenna mentioned, reauthorized the ESEA, which aims to close the achievement gap. The IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Part B, grants to states $11.1 billion. Improving Teacher Quality receives $2.9 billion. 21st Century Community Learning Centers receive $991 million. English language learners receive $675.8 million. Finally, Impact Aid, schools which are impacted by military bases and other facilities, receives about $1.2 billion. But states can forego these funds if they choose not to abide by the program. If they choose not to accept the federal funding to support local income students or students with disabilities, this can have a dramatic effect on students. Low wealth districts experience the majority of deficits in educational funding, with consequences including teacher layoffs, increased class sizes, and reduced counseling and after-school services due to the source of public school funding, which is local property taxes. Low wealth districts should provide more services due to their high rates of child poverty, children who have food and housing insecurities, lack of health care, and live in adverse conditions. However, only 12 states provide more funding to low wealth districts than high wealth, and only 5 of those 12 provide enough funding that provides the students the resources they need. When there is equitable funding, states see higher graduation rates and higher household income, and the gaps between rich and poor decrease significantly. So we're going to move on to our civics trivia. Okay. So our first question will be, so under FAPE guidelines, students with disabilities will receive public education if they meet what requirements? Answer choice A, must be evaluated by a FAPE state employee. Answer choice B, a mental or physical impairment that limits one or more life activity. Answer choice C, must meet low income requirements. And answer choice D, must be enrolled in a public school for a minimum of 2 years. So the correct answer for this question is answer choice B, a mental or physical impairment that limits one or more life activity. Question 2, what precedent did the Brown versus Board Court case set? Answer choice A, all persons have the opportunity to access public education. B, separate yet equal education was not equal. Answer choice C, private, non-religious affiliated schools and public schools cannot deny admission to students on the basis of race. Answer choice D, which is both A and B, and then answer choice E is all of the above. For this question, the correct answer is answer choice D, which is both A and B. And I'm just going to list A and B. So A is all persons have the opportunity to access public education, and B, separate yet equal education was not equal. And then finally, our last question is, what entity receives the most federal funds for their education program? Answer choice A, IDA, which is known as the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Answer choice B, Impact Military Schools. And answer choice C, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as ESEA. And this question, the correct answer is C, ESEA. And here's our answer key. And if you want more information about these questions, you can find them here on our slides. And I believe we're going to send them out in the follow-up email. So before we end, I would like to invite everyone to the next Civics Project next Sunday, August 22nd at 2 p.m. PDT on domestic terrorism. On August 29th, we'll be hosting Nicole Hernandez from Puerto Ricans in Action, who will be talking with Repair about Puerto Rico and its status as a U.S. territory. On September 5th, we'll be focusing on youth incarceration and our guests will be Dominique Nong of the Children's Defense Fund and Edgar Ibarra, an activist and survivor of youth incarceration. And if you enjoyed hearing from the Repair student team, we'll be back in September to talk about gun violence. Aside from our upcoming Civics Project episodes, Repair is hosting its next event on white nationalism, titled In God's Name, a conversation about white nationalism and faith on August 25th at 4 p.m. PDT, featuring Aziza Hassan, Umar Hakim Day, Dove Kent, and Sophie Bajork James. All of our events are free and closed caption. Thank you so much to our wonderful Zoom audience for joining us this week for the Civics Project.